Today, the coming tech-Washington collision.
Wherein the Pentagon sends a strong signal to Silicon Valley.
Then, are we seeing the end of Web 2.0? And if so, what's next?
And the algorithmic rabbit hole. Why can't YouTube stop online radicalization?
All that on Future Forward. I'm Steve Rosenbaum.
And I'm DeRose. Steve, let us launch.
Let's just start with the news from last week. We had a huge week. We had one of those VC favorite up into the right hockey stick weeks. Huge numbers, great audience. It may well have been the fact that we were special guests on Brian McCullough's Tech Meme Ride Home Weekend podcast, in which case, welcome to all of our Tech Meme friends joining us, hopefully for the second week. Hopefully they sampled us and they're coming back. That would be great. But it was a great week and it was a great show. So feel good about that.
Yeah. And look, we need everyone's help on an ongoing basis. Please subscribe, get in, do the downloads, like us, review us. Every single one of those things matters. And of course, this week, a big shout out to our friends, as usual, at IEEE Spectrum. IEEE Spectrum is the flagship magazine and website of the IEEE, the world's largest professional organization devoted to engineering and the applied sciences. And we are going to start with a story that they reported in great detail.
Yeah, this is one of those things. We've seen the skirmishes, right? We've seen the little Washington says to, the Valley, bad, slap your wrist. But the Valley, by the way, has its own internal battles where employees are saying, wait, we don't want to be doing, military contracting, either Chinese or U.S. And that puts folks like Google in a tough position. The thing I found fascinating about the IEEE piece from this week, and obviously we'll have the links in the podcast notes for those of you that want to check it out. The thing I found fascinating was, everyone reported, that Sundar was in Washington to meet with the Pentagon, but it's worth remembering that like he just wasn't happening to swing by DC and while he was in town said hi. I mean, he was summoned.
There's a lot going on. And look, the headline that we're kind of taking this in a few different pieces, but the big news, and it's a great IEEE article on it, is that the Pentagon warned Silicon Valley about aiding the Chinese military, which really goes right to what you said about working for the military in general and the clash between profits and customers and, the morality of these new age companies.
I like this article a lot, and part of what I like about the Spectrum reporting on it is, it's clearly not political. They're not taking sides. They're not calling, Washington names. They're not calling, not blaming the Valley. But it really does kind of peel the onion a little bit and say, and here's the thing that I found I took away from it. Like, what Trump and what Washington is saying to the Valley is, be a good American company and don't help the Chinese because they're the enemy. Right. And I had two reactions to that. One is, are they the enemy? Because I guess I didn't get the memo.
Right.
And two, and this is complicated and the comments are going to go nuts at us about it, but I'm going to say it anyway. Like, if you looked at the underlying DNA of Google, is it really an American company? I
think it is an American company, but look, one thing we've learned in the last 2 years is that the Pentagon speaking to the country is not even close to the same thing as Trump speaking to the country. And so there's some crazy kind of things going on. And I think, for us, we're right to kind of look at it from the Silicon Valley point of view. But from the Washington and the ideological point of view, there's a clash inherent in the basic principles of right-wing laissez-faire, economies, right? Open markets mean open markets to the entire world. It means forget about the morality. We're here for the bottom dollar. And no less than Trump has been all about that in certain instances, except where he's got to pick a fight, right? Yeah. So this is hard stuff. And there are conflicts that are unavoidable. And the transparency of the internet is a double-edged sword.
Yeah. I'd love to know the numbers in terms of like Google's number of employees, U.S. versus non-U.S., Google's revenue, U.S. versus non-U.S. I mean, certainly, the thing is, I'm not sure, and again, more trouble in the comments, but like, I'm not sure that, is Apple a U.S. company? Is everybody has business all over the world, offices all over the world, technology transfer all over the world. I get if you're exporting what the Pentagon determines is military grade, whatever, hardware, software to a enemy, but there is no doubt that Google needs to do business with China.
There's no doubt, and it is. But I think there's a question. There shouldn't. There's a question about the Chinese military or things that go beyond that. And of course, in China, you don't really know. So many would-be capitalist companies are organs or supported by the state. So there's just such inherent conflict. Disclaimer, I'm not making this analogy in a direct way, but it reminds me a little bit of once transparency happens and the bad behavior of cops becomes something that everyone becomes aware of. Look, Microsoft and IBM, companies that have been around for 30 or 40 years, have been doing business with militaries, governments, foreign agents, forever. This is just part of business, but light is being shed on it now.
And by the way, they pay their bills, right?
They pay their bills, except for the parking tickets at the UN, as we understand as New Yorkers.
By the way, if you want to worry about something China's doing, here's the thing that I think is worth worrying about. China has said very clearly they think there's a arms race in AI, and they want to win. And they are putting an enormous amount of resources into AI and supercomputing and quantum computing and all this stuff, and the line between, military and non-military is, essentially non-existent.
Yeah. And honestly, the behavior, again, I'll just go back to the ideological side of this. The behavior of Pentagon or any national organ, dictating what a private organization should be doing, it almost smacks of you and I have been around. At the beginning of the digital era, we always ran into countries like Germany and France and Israel where they were like nationalist, socialist, military. This is almost what far left countries do because everything's so fused together and a little bit not open market. So I think there's some conflicts here that Washington has to resolve. And look, you can do whatever you want, Google, Apple, everyone else, about your corporate culture, but your public companies, you have a responsibility to shareholders. That's what you get for your options.
So Atlantic has an article, and at first I thought it was too old to include in the conversation, and then I realized it was the middle of December of last year, which, is only old by new high-speed web media standards.
Right.
And they suggest. This is Amy Zagart's article. Yep. She suggests that the divide is between Silicon Valley and Washington, and that divide is a national security threat. And I thought she made a really compelling argument for that.
Look, I think there's no doubt about it. The transparency and the openness and the, by definition, globalized nature of the internet means you just can't protect everything without clamping down and operating the way China does, right? Which is to control the internet itself from within. So I don't really know, there just needs to be better dialogue. And by the way, this little kerfuffle that involves who your corporate customers are really has nothing to do, except in a simplistic way, with Washington needing to regulate or break up big social media companies or big consumer powerhouses. This is about enterprise business.
Yeah, and the reality is, I don't think that's going to happen any more than, as I think about it, right? So does Boeing sell planes to Air China? China doesn't build.
I don't know the answer to that, but believe me, there's lots of conflicts like that, and no less than Trump made a specific example of just that as it involved Saudi Arabia a couple months ago, right? He was like, Boeing and, we need to make sure we get that business with the Middle East, and it doesn't matter what journalist they killed or whatever.
Yeah. By the way, that's an excellent. Have you been rehearsing your Trump impersonation?
No, I would do that with a little pinched kind of, And by the way, anyone that hasn't, I just have to say this, and it's off point, but anyone that has not slowed down or slowed down to 1.5 speed, anything that Trump says because it makes him sound like an old drunk, needs to do that.
All right. So let's move on to chapter 2 here. There was a letter that went out late last week from the CEO of Stack Overflow, Joel Spolsky, and it just made me nostalgic. I read it, and I don't know if you saw it.
So it's a snapshot of the letter because I think it's telling.
Well, he talks about so Stack Overflow is essentially an online community for developers. Share ideas, share links. It relates indirectly to GitHub in some interesting ways in terms of that, the early open source movement and the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that, every developer shouldn't have to write every line of code to solve every little, kind of, problem. He and he's all, they have a bunch of products. I mean, they ran a really good help desk ticketing system, on the name of which is going to slip my mind for a moment. But he's kind of a generation, the leader of tech companies, in which really the technologists, the developers, the engineers were the leaders. And he was kind of the king of that world. And by the way, I don't
time in those 5 or 7 years, really post.com, because it didn't happen as much .com, when you started to see engineers become CEOs and like UX people, not business people, not marketing people, along with those people as well. And look, these are vast, incredibly democratized and leveling communities that have given lessons to social media itself and have become their own huge ecosystems. And in a way, I think they're examples of the best stuff out there in terms of the good they do and what they share. And honestly, I go onto those places every once in a while because I can usually find a little bit that an idiot like me can understand or grok, to use one of their words.
So in the letter, he writes some data, which I didn't know. They have 300 employees. Did not know that. They're doing $70 million a year in revenue. Not an insignificant shop. And unclear to me why he's ready to move on. No drama, no bad, nothing terrible. It seemed more like, I've been at this a long time and I want to kick back a little bit. So he's go on. No. I mean, he's moving up to chairman.
Well, what I was going to say is, it's binary to me. If you have a belief in the missionary and have a missionary zeal for what the community does and its importance, and that it be protected and able to grow and be nourished and not shot down and things like that. There are people that spend their lives in a certain, profession for that reason and can be innovators forever. On the flip side, he sounds a little bit more like somebody who likes to invent and create new things. And I don't really think there's a ton more to be done within that framework, except nurture it and, adapt. It's sort of like open source itself, adapt to things that belong there and not get too lost in it. So I feel like he was speaking a little bit like a guy that wants to invent something new.
Well, that would be, by the way, the parent company is Fog Creek Software. And I don't remember. I'm trying to remember the name of the customer service CSR platform. It's not coming to me. But I guess they also birthed Trello, which I did not know.
That I didn't know. I guess I would have, yeah, remembered. And it reminds me, the sophistication and vastness of this, when you compare it to something like, remember Tech Republic, which is kind of shared message boards for tech people, our good friends, the brothers, Jesus, I'm drawing a blank.
That's all
who
right.
ran for mayor. They sold that in 98, 99 and made their fortune. So I don't know. It's an interesting and necessary space. And are we going to mention the other one that got an exit too here?
Yeah, we should talk about GitHub because that one I feel differently about. I mean, keep in mind one is an exit and one is a changing of the guard. Different, related but different. But
and what's your sort of hang up? Because I do believe, Stack Overflow is a little more angled towards support and question and answer. It's like a deep, vast kind of Quora for coding solutions, even though there's a lot of code posted and stuff. Whereas GitHub is a little more about sharing, posting, and distributing code itself. And Microsoft, do you not like the community, or do you not like this marriage?
At the risk of being biased, which listeners know I am, my experience is that everything Microsoft has bought, it's fucked up.
I'm completely with you on that. I do not trust the ability for them not to kind of, and by the way, they blow hot and cold with this. I think they either bring things too in-house and shut them down and try to bend them towards the arc of whatever Windows needs to be, or whatever, or they kind of leave them out there flailing by themselves, which is kind of what I think has happened with Skype and a few other things, and we'll see with some of the more consumer ones, because I haven't heard anything about Minecraft that bespoke some positive influence from Microsoft.
Yeah. So
but this one seems to be really close to the bone.
I mean, it seems to me that GitHub is exactly at that moment, right? So they sold for $7.5 billion in June of last year. So let's be clear, that's not a rounding error number, that's a real number. So if you're Microsoft, you've put some metrics against that purchase. You have some reasons why you think it's going to be synergistic, I hate that word, with your other things, but you also want to see the revenue numbers grow. So what do? Well, you tick up the subscription a little bit, and you add another premium service, and you tick down what people get for the entry point. You essentially just fiddle the knobs because people essentially are captured, right? I mean, and by the way, the answer, if you're Microsoft, is look, if you don't like it, then don't use GitHub anymore.
And by the way, let's just break it down, unpack it a little bit, which is that, I'm one of these people who, because I kind of tend to focus on marketing and consumer markets, I'm not so smart or knowledgeable about what happens at corporate enterprises, which is a vast world of its own making. And so I always wondered how Microsoft was actually doing better the last few years suddenly. And it's because they're getting deeper and deeper and more invaluable in those corporate enterprises. GitHub is an attempt for them to expand their reach into the more independent worlds. There are company and corporate global 500 companies that don't let you outside their firewall to even play in a place like GitHub, right? So there's an overlap and a reason. And honestly, if they could bring a light overlapping and benefits to both sides, that would be cool. But it kind of reminds me in New York, for instance, of big corporate companies sending people to go work in co-working spaces who work for them, right? It's like, it's a little alien. They're going to show up on the Friday, no suits with their elbow patch sweaters, looking like they don't really quite belong.
Yeah. So by the way, help from our listeners here. Like I'm sure there are other examples in the Web 2.0 to Web ? Era that, there are other sales or downgrades or closures that I could have made a laundry list and I didn't get around to it, but I also,
Steve, let me just ask you then, because actually I took it in a different direction. What do you think on the Web 2.0? Maybe we should start with why these companies are Web 2.0 to a certain extent is because how deeply social they are, even while bringing benefits in a kind of a traditional sense to companies. That's kind of the point, right? And by the way, we collaborate on this, but Steve titled the chapter "What's After Web 2.0," and so I think that is basically the reason. But how do you see that? Because obviously AI and all these other things are what's next, but I don't know.
But I guess I thought of Web 2.0 as, again, we could spend a whole episode just defining what that word means and who invented it. Right. And Tim O'Reilly, right? And
yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, or at least he. Yeah. I guess I thought of Web 2.0 as a social phenomenon.
I think so.
Yeah.
A collaborative phenomenon that would cut across, at a corporate level, companies, being in their isolated silos, but it also embraced social networks and mobile social kind of things that emerged. So really, it's 2006, 7, 8, birth of Facebook onward. So yeah, I guess I think what is next.
Yeah, well, I mean, not to be overly grim, because I like the pod to be kind of upbeat, but in this case, I think that what we're all coming to terms with is that, when you look at the fact that 80% of all ad revenue now goes to Facebook and Google, the oxygen for innovation is, at least for the time being, fairly stifled. And there are some really smart people. We should do an episode on this, actually. I mean, the whole life, death, future, and risk of the open web is very much on the table and not guaranteed.
I agree with that 100%, and I also think, it's yet another step in the maturing of the web and the digital space, where it starts to just kind of become synonymous with all business and all cultures. So to take these little narrow, this trend defines everything, it starts to become more and more kind of specious and oversimplifying things. These sectors, trillion-dollar sectors, are being taken over, and they have nothing to do with each other.
All right. So let's move to chapter 3, because we've got just a couple minutes left, and it's important. This has been hanging in the air for a while and is now finally kind of like out in the open. YouTube's product chief kind of engaged this question of online radicalization and what the New York Times characterized as algorithmic rabbit holes. And just to kind of set the table, 70% of YouTube's views come from the video it suggests after the video you watch. So when you watch a video about makeup or hairstyles or or Islamic fundamentalism, whichever you watch, YouTube has a whole bunch of data about your viewing patterns and about other things that will capture your imagination. And the computer, the algorithm, says, if you like this, you'll probably watch this.
That's right. And practically
yeah.
speaking, I just want to make sure we have a razor point on it. Practically speaking, this is because when it first started, YouTube was original for this, and now you see it in a lot of places. It'll auto feed up the next video.
Yeah.
I wonder what the data is actually on people actually selecting that second video versus it just auto plays and it can go on and on. There has long been criticisms of the kind of hollowness of some of YouTube's viewing numbers, because that could go on if I don't touch it, or if I turn my sound off and I move to another window, that could be just playing for like 4 hours and I wouldn't be consuming it. So I believe there's a down slope, but nonetheless, some people are grippingly watching one thing to the next. And it is true that as we discussed 2 weeks ago, there's a slide towards radicalization by definition, because things that are more dramatic and compelling and, juicy, that's why they call it red meat, right?
So I thought Mohan's response was very well rehearsed. And,
Yes.
look, here's the problem. If when you go to CVS, CVS doesn't have any moral problem having shelves and shelves and shelves of candy and junk food.
Yeah.
They did stop selling cigarettes. Good for them. But as a place that theoretically is thought of as a healthy place that helps you with healthcare and vitamins and beauty products and hair shampoo and razor blades, they don't think that people leaving with a bag of those corn, the little Halloween candies, whatever those things are. Candy corn is a problem, even though it's sugar and it's bad for you, whatever. I think that YouTube, in a sense, is saying, look, when we find something that we know is bad and that we can agree is not censorship, and we agree is bad, which we have to define bad in all kinds of ways, then we take it down and don't put it in our automatic algorithm sharing thing. But the problem is, when you look at how much of the conversations around, say, anti-vax or, flat earth or, the Holocaust deniers or, the both sides, KKKs, like all that stuff used to mostly stay off the front page of our papers and the front pages screens of our devices. And now in the last, I don't know, you tell me, 2 years, 3 years, it seems like somehow the arguments about free speech have unleashed this torrent of self-referential rabbit hole algorithm videos that show no signs of slowing down.
Well, I think that's very well said by you. And I think it's because even though we criticize the slow movement towards the singularity and the weaknesses and the shortcomings of, AI and big data and stuff, there are some increasingly sophisticated engines churning around that are able to do things that may not be good, may not be bad, but they're designed to make money, create compelling content, move you from one thing to the next. Look, I believe this is not unrelated to the rise of, Taboola and all the remnant content that floats at the bottom of these screens that generates huge amounts of money and is like half the time is the equivalent of like National Enquirer stuff, right? We hate clicking on those things, but we do it anyway. And I think that's as much a marker in this as YouTube is, and it's as much a thing that how is that supposed to get stopped?
All right, I'm going to defend Taboola for a minute. I don't like some of the Taboola content, but I know the company rather well, and I know that they have some pretty big initiatives in building high-quality, curated news presences, particularly in the Android world. And I applaud them for having a more nuanced role about content.
Look, this is a good, it's you and I do agree and disagree at different times. So it is good to disagree. And I don't know that we do, but I have really, really excellent journalist who's now working at one of those companies, and he was making claims about all this stuff. And it's true. And by the way, I don't begrudge them this. But they're designed to, clickbait has like a, obviously negative connotation, but clickbait is exactly what that stuff is supposed to do, right? So, they have to sort of tread a line where they still get their business done for people. I tend to think that news sites in particular devalue themselves by going for the easy money and including that stuff around the edges of them. But we could talk about this one all day.
So I'm going to leave you with, there's a bunch of interesting conversation at Pop Dust, and we'll put the link in the show notes, about kind of the slow downward spiral of YouTube from normal to weirdness. And like, the problem is what I think the algorithm does really badly, and maybe we'll never do well, is be able to differentiate between, that's edgy but kind of funny, and that's really actually objectionable and kind of inappropriate. And it comes down to, and this is where I think we're going to see a big conversation happen, the idea that platforms aren't publishers, I think is an idea whose time has now come and gone. I think they got to hide behind, safe harbor for long enough to be big companies, and now I think they ought to actually hire editors and be publishers.
That's exactly right. And we talked about this ironically and orthogonally in relation to Apple last week. It comes down to you hiring people with experience and knowledge
and managing some of this stuff, because this stuff cannot be done by machines and software, and they are in that space, and they have a responsibility. Every single one of the big guys, I would even include Amazon, even though they're the farthest from it, but Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, ad stuff. It's going to be an interesting next few years. Maybe our old journalistic backgrounds become a little more marketable than we thought.
I got it. I got the theme for the show. I just nailed it. Web 3.0, return to human editorial, return to human voices.
Guess who was a little bit on that rap, and we talked about a few months ago, which is our friend Doug Rushkoff.
There we go. Doug has it. Web 3.0, humans.
I know. Return to humanity.
All right. It's been a good week.
You too.
Talk to you. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.